Okay, where am I sound at? There we are. So now I've moved my couch because I want to use my laptop so I can do some writing because I don't have a whiteboard at home. But first things first, what I want to talk about, as soon as my pen sticks there, is we're going to be reading The New Psychology of Leadership. And so that's our very first book here. The first two chapters were assigned, and normally these lectures that I give online are going to be focused more towards explaining the theories, but really these theories aren't too complex just yet. And I can give some examples, but these first two chapters are really just kind of a historical rundown, and so I'll explain some of the theories that are there, but for the most part they're just explaining these theories so that they can explain what they lack, and so they don't get too in-depth on the actual theories themselves. They mostly say this is what it talks about and here's where it's lacking. Remember from my first introduction video, I kind of mentioned that these guys are really trying to sell a product here, right? They're trying to sell this new theory, and the idea here is not necessarily that they're saying that these, well, I guess it is more or less. They're saying that these theories are out of date and they just don't cut it. But the fact is that they do hold some weight. The field itself is progressing through these theories, and for the most part, they are kind of out of date. But they still do hold some significance. In that they can explain why some things happens and how to look at some things, how to explain some things that happen in group dynamics, but then also they paint a picture of what's lacking and say that our theory, this new psychology, is kind of all-encompassing. It hits the things that these old theories are kind of lacking. So the first thing I want to do is show you that now I've posted a question, like a forum where you guys can post some questions either about the reading or about the content itself or about the lecture, the video that you're about to watch. But like I said, this video is basically going to give an overview of the theories, and then as you read, you'll get in depth behind these theories a little bit more. I just want to pull these up so I can explain how to do the assignments too, as soon as that comes. Here we are. So I've pasted in, here we are, a weekly questions forum. So I'm going to do that every week. And so if you have any questions about anything that we're covering content-wise, make sure to post it there so that everybody can see it. That way I can explain it to you a little bit further. So first things first, let's talk about the reading. The first thing I want to kind of point out is that a couple pages in, like second page, they're really talking about something that I think that a lot of people kind of overlook in psychology, and it's the idea of persuasion. Second paragraph on the second page, second full paragraph in there, it says it's a capacity, they're talking about leadership, it's a capacity to convince others to contribute to the process that turns ideas and visions into reality. And so, running low on battery, let me plug in here. And so what they're talking about there is the concept of persuasion that we kind of learned about through Aristotle back in, 700 or something. And if you've taken an English class, and you'll know why, that's obviously a clear indicator of why I'm focusing on this, you've heard the concept ethos, pathos, and logos. Ethos, pathos, and logos. And so this is the theory that basically any type of persuasion that we have that exists in our talking or acting or visual world is made up of these three. So any persuasion. And that is a term we call rhetoric. And that's something that you hear in writing a lot. But I'm pointing it out here because then in the next paragraph he goes on to talk about followers can only be moved to respond enthusiastically to a leader's instructions when they see the leader as someone who's psychologically aligned with the followers. And so what this is talking about particularly here is ethos. And this idea here is that followers are only going to follow someone that they think is an ethical person, that they think is aligned with their own psychologies. And so, in essence, the leader is saying, I'm ethical, I'm just like you, in that I hold the same values that you hold. I hold the things important that you also hold important, so help me help you. And so that's kind of the idea of, well, let me turn off my camera, remember, you don't really need that anymore. Whoops. that's what they're talking about there on the second page. It kind of sets it up for the idea of what's called the great man theory. And it's not really necessarily a theory as much as it is just a way to describe leaders. They looked at all leaders, and this was for a good while, up and through, well, it looks like up and through 2008 even. And that's what I'm saying is, like, these theories aren't necessarily outdated. People still look at these theories, people still follow them, and people still subscribe to them, for lack of a better term. And so these ideas go all the way up through 2008, and all leaders can be observed for their individual traits. And these traits here, that's what makes them great men. And so one of the big questions here is that when you start looking at the traits of great men or great women, the theory is actually called great men, though. That's why I'm saying that. If you look at that, they're primarily looking at these single traits that either they were born with or they developed. And so the idea there is you have to question, you have to ask yourself, and that's a good reflection question, is if you're looking at the great man idea, and that means that a trait is required, a specific trait, whether that be charisma, whether that be honesty, intelligence, whatever that is was the person born with that, or is it something that's developed? And so there's really no clear answer to that. No one's really decided, what is it? The new theory that these authors are kind of projecting is one that is kind of dynamic in several different instances, and so it's almost impossible for a person to be born with it. So I would say that the authors of this book suggest that it's developed rather than you're born with it, than an inherent trait. And so as we kind of read through this a little bit more, they start to actually get into, they go from great men to actually talking about specific great men, quote, great men, because then they go into the idea of dictators. And I'm not going to talk too much about that because everybody's familiar with the famous dictators. You have Joseph Stalin, you have Hitler, all those guys. Obama, no, I'm kidding. Not Obama. And then you start to, they on page 7, they kind of go through these dictators and they explain how people have looked at them. And they kind of go on to explain that these dictators, when they were looking at the traits that they bore, oftentimes it was a charismatic individual. But more specifically, these people started looking at, and we'll even talk about intelligence. And the D word here? Dominance. Talk about dominance. And with these traits, they actually come to find out, or they come to believe, that these traits are one of two things. Another debate where they kind of said, is it born or is it developed? Well, now they're kind of questioning a few years later, is this a gift or is this a disorder? Basically asking the question, look at Hitler, for example. Obviously he had a few screws loose, right? And so if we go from looking at great men, great leaders, and looking at their individual traits, are these gifts or are these disorders? Because a lot of times you have this charismatic and intelligent, dominant individual who, in the case of Hitler, does these horrible things. And there's always kind of a point, and this kind of leads back to our assignment, the downfall assignment. There's a point where these leaders fall, where they become not so good anymore, or they become not so appropriate for the job. And that's kind of where the new theory comes in, that these authors are kind of trying to project here, is that these leaders didn't stay great leaders forever. They eventually had this downfall, and our new theory kind of explains why that happened. And so now, from here, from these gifts and disorders, they kind of started looking at the idea of traits, kind of led them to the point of these individualistic personality traits. And this is where it actually starts to get interesting for me, because they start to project some of this data. And on page 9 particularly, because we have an assignment here, and the leadership analysis discussion, old leadership Old Psychology of Leadership. I'm asking for your thoughts here, particularly on page 9. Okay, so here's a bunch of me talking, and I'm going to give you the short of it. You do still need to kind of go back and read it, but basically on page 9 they provide you with a good amount of data here, and this is the type of stuff that you're going to run into as you're looking through scholarly sources in the field of psychology. You're going to find this kind of data, and what they've done particularly here is if you look at the top at the table there, and make sure I'm not skipping over anything. Right, so the first paragraph here, they're just kind of talking. Trying to highlight this for you. You're talking about, or I'm talking about, this new psychology that these authors are trying to project. And so the reason they do that is because they kind of talk about how all this old research hasn't really been able to pinpoint a particular trait, right? They've talked about charisma, dominance, intelligence, and they're looking at all these individualistic personality traits. And in this particular one, you can see that they're talking about intelligence, adjustment, extroversion, sensitivity, masculinity, conservatism, dominance. And right off the bat, you're kind of thinking like, okay, well, there's, sure, I mean, for me, extroversion, introversion, for me, that's a big dichotomy. A dichotomy is kind of a gap between two things. Like, it's set two clear groups. In the middle would be the dichotomy. And with extroversion and introversion, it really creates a clear dichotomy because you have, they're essentially saying that only extroverted people can be good leaders, and I don't really think that that's the case, and apparently neither do the authors because they are pointing this out. But kind of going back to the data a little bit and back to the assignment, what they've done on page 9 is they've ran what's called a correlation analysis, and they try and find out of all these people that had these traits, 196 for intelligence, 164 for adjustment, I'm reading this from the chart on page 9, 39 for dominance. What is the correlation of that particular trait to their leadership ability? And so you can see that here in this middle paragraph, I kind of explain it. A correlation, if you were to run that analysis, the data there in the fourth column, 0.25, 0.15, 0.15, less than 0.10 question mark, 0.20, a correlation has to have a 0.30 to have even any semblance of a significant correlation. Anything less than that's a very weak correlation, anything from 0 to 0.3, and then 0.3 to 0.5 is kind of a moderate, and then 0.5 and above is a very strong correlation. And so the reason I tell you this isn't because I need you to go out and be some kind of statistician or run all these analyses yourself because I expect you to go out and get a doctorate. No, I'm telling you this because all of the scholarly sources that you find, if you find what's called an empirical, where are we at here? Come on, scroll down. I want to scroll down. No, not going to let me? All right. If you're looking at it, empirical, oh, there it goes, scrolling down. I'm not even sure if I spelled that right. Scholarly article, which is what you'll find if you use the library's database. A lot of times you'll find empirical scholarly article. And empirical, what that means is that the research was conducted firsthand. That means I did the research. I did the research, and I'm telling you about what I did in the research and what I found. That's like that table on page 9. When Mann presented that in his, doesn't say the name of the article, but when he presented that in his article, that was his research, and he was presenting it firsthand. He said, this is what I did, and this is what I found. So that makes it empirical. Now, scholarly means that it was peer-reviewed by other scholars. And the article just means it was published, which nowadays doesn't necessarily mean much because anybody can publish anything they want on a website. But that's why whenever I say scholarly article, it has to be peer-reviewed by scholars and published. So anyways, the reason I'm telling you this, because these are the types of things that you're going to run into. You're going to have to look at some of this data that these guys present, and you're going to have to read it and try and make sense of it a little bit. Granted, I know you guys aren't getting a degree in statistics, so I understand that there's a limited degree of how much you're going to need to know. But having said that, what I'm looking at with this particular assignment is, even though if you look at intelligence, well, let me back up. What I want from you in this particular assignment is I want you to look at that data and tell me what you think about it. What is your takeaway from this? Granted, they say that there is a weak correlation, 0.25, and remember, 0.30 is moderate. meaning there's a good chance that there is a true correlation there. But the intelligence is a 0.25, so it's just kind of shy of that. What does that say to you? Does that mean that intelligence doesn't have any input on a person's leadership ability? And then on the same coin, what about dominance? Dominance is a 0.20. We're 0.1 shy of being a moderate correlation, being a moderate correlate, meaning that it has a moderate relationship with it, meaning that intelligence to some degree does seem to impact leadership ability. Same thing with dominance. It's a low impact, but it does seem to have some impact. Now you have smaller things like masculinity, and that's less than 0.10, which is really, really, really small. So very little. But what does that mean to you? If you look at all of these together, what does that necessarily mean? And if you look at conservatism, that one's kind of interesting. Because in the third column there, you see that it's actually listed as a negative. So that makes you question a few things in life, right? Because if you look at these leaders, I mean, right now we have leaders in the workplace who are a little bit more conservative with their values. What does that mean when he listed it as a negative value? What does that say to you? So kind of going back to the assignment now. Let's see. These are the data that I urge you to analyze on your own as you dive into the research in the field of psychology, finding sources for your own research. That's what I'm talking about with scholarly articles. These values will help you understand what the research is really saying, and you'll be able to use this data to prove your own perspective. Because the idea here is that if you were to try and tell me that if you were to tell me intelligence is a good indicator of leadership ability, and then you cited this information, you said, even though intelligence is only a 0.25 correlation, meaning it's not quite moderate, not quite significant, but it's still there. And out of these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 variables here, you have dominance, conservatism, masculinity, sensitivity. Out of all of them, that's the highest, and it's very close to having a mild effect. So I feel like intelligence is a good indicator of a person's leadership skill, and you'd be able to kind of make that argument. That's what's happening whenever you're using these scholarly articles to persuade your reader, right? That's what you're doing. You're using ethos, saying I'm ethical, and in this case, you're using data, so that's logos, logic. But you're using that to persuade your reader, and so you can kind of talk about that as you would. Now, for this assignment, I want you to reflect on this data and tell me what it means to you, kind of like what I was just saying here. Even though Mann noted that these correlations are weak, what else can you draw from this information? What does it mean to you that of all the variables, intelligence showed the highest correlation? Does it mean anything to you that intelligence is only 0.05 or being short of a moderate correlation? Does it mean that dominance showed the second? What does it mean that dominance showed the second? Does that mean that someone needs to be intelligent but also a little bit dominant? What about sensitivity and masculinity? Those being the lowest, what does that say to you? Because then you have to think, there are obviously female leaders, and so whenever Mann looked into that, I mean, you could historically look at it and say, well, that was wrong of him to look at masculinity in the first place because we have female leaders. But more so, what does it show that there's a low level of relationship between masculinity and leadership skill there? Because if you're looking at that, it's low. So what does that say about men in leadership? What does that mean to you about men in leadership nowadays? Because we obviously still have men in leadership roles. Does that mean that they're less masculine, or that it just doesn't have any type of impact on their leadership ability? So reread the part of the section that notes a person can have too much of a seemingly good thing. That's on page 9, about halfway down. It literally like right in the middle of the page. Stogdill therefore observed that the leader is likely to be more intelligent, but not too much more intelligent than the group that is being led. Then it goes on towards the bottom from Stogdill's quote, and it says the pattern of personal characteristics must bear some relevant relationship to the characteristics, activities, and goals of the followers. And so that's just his interpretation. In 250 words. I'll highlight this for you. Explain your observations of the data outlined on page 9 and outlined earlier in this description here. And considering his discussion, what he thinks of it, explain how these data is actually a plural word, that's why I keep saying these, datum is a singular, and how these data may or may not, you choose, reflect what Stogdill is suggesting. So do you agree with what Stogdill is saying, or do you think, no, not really, I think intelligence, and I think maybe you think masculinity is a big part of a leadership role. You don't necessarily have to use the data to back it up. You could also argue with this data. You could say that no, intelligence has nothing to do with it, even though it's almost significantly correlated to leadership skill. Be sure to provide an example to help your reader better understand what you're talking about. Give me an example of a life experience that you've had in which maybe you experienced a very low intelligent but high masculinity leader and was a good leader. That might be something that you could use to argue with him. On the other hand, maybe you had a highly intelligent female leader, and that kind of argues to the same point that Stogdill's data kind of represents here. But basically, I just want you to tell me, what can you draw from this data? And from your own experiences, how does this data kind of reflect or completely go off in another direction based on what you've experienced in the workplace? All right, so going back now, the next one, I'm going to kind of continue going through the chapter a little bit. Page 9, on page 10, they start looking at biographies. And so it's really difficult to kind of note a good leader in the midst of them being a good leader. So for instance, people don't really note the things that Trump has done right now, but there's a good chance that after Trump is out of his presidency that people will look back and say either he was a good leader or a bad leader. Of course, right now a lot of people are saying he's a horrible leader, but we can't really say that for sure until we see the impact of his actions. And so that's where they kind of came up with a biographical approach. Keyword there kind of being biography, because you're looking back at that person. You're looking back at their life. And you're trying to deduce what made them great. And from this, though, the problem becomes is that they're still looking at that individualistic. This is still focused on individual traits, and that, according to the authors here, that's just not right. That's not what we should be doing. And so then we kind of continue to go through the chapter, and they talk a little bit about President Bush, which I thought was really a good thing, because they talked about how Bush has Bushisms and how he was really portrayed in the media as someone that was low level of intelligence. But then whenever he talked about things that he was really interested in, he actually had a very good handle on the American English, on the English language. But it seemed like when he was put in front of the camera and talking about things that he didn't really have interest in, like foreign policy, then he would kind of stumble over his words, and he would try and make jokes that just really weren't coherent, and it made him look like he was kind of dumb. And so they talk about that there. They talk about that very clear dichotomy, the very clear difference between interested Bush and uninterested Bush, and how that differed. And they talked about, when they go into the political deficiencies of individualistic models, just basically how looking back at political leaders and trying to identify these single items just isn't working. And so then at the end of the chapter, they kind of call for a new psychology, which is really what they're selling in this book, remember. They start talking about the 5 things that needs to happen. And they say it needs to have it needs to be non-individualistic, it needs to be context sensitive, it needs to be perspective sensitive, it needs to be able to be empirically proven, and it needs to have inspirational and transformative character. Man, my cat's trying to jump on me. Get off. No love here. All right. And so that was essentially chapter 1. And chapter 2 is a much shorter chapter as far as content goes, because we're starting to get into the actual theory. And so I'll kind of break through this pretty quick. You have what they call the situational approach. And this is just the authors trying to go a little bit further through the history of leadership psychology. And so they talk about this on page 22, and this is kind of suggesting that the situational approach is that it really has nothing to do with traits. There's really no trait significance here, because essentially it's just kind of all based on situation. It's situational, right? And so with that being said, it doesn't matter who's in charge. It just matters in who's in the right situation at the right time, right? And then the contingency one, the contingency approach is kind of going on the idea that somebody's gonna take this up, right? Oh, we lost sound there. Hello? There we go. Okay. Where was I? So the contingency approach. So this is kind of, they talk about this as the perfect match, right? And this kind of suggests that, again, it's based on the idea that the person here who meets the needs of the group, so to speak, comes in and kind of is able to fulfill these needs. And so let's see, on page 25 we kind of get into the three components, and it talks about where are we at? They call it they reference the LPC, the least preferred coworker, and they talk about how you need really three things to be a good leader, to be that perfect match, right, for the needs of the group. The quality relation between the leader and the group members. So there needs to be a good relationship there. Which at this part, everybody's kind of thinking like, well, no doubt, right? Duh, you're going to need to have someone that people can look up to, because then we go back up to these guys, and even though these old theories have their limitations, there's still the idea that they have to be ethical. You have to be able to say, I'm just like you, and I have the same interests in mind as the members of the group. Otherwise, they're not, the group isn't going to see you as a fit leader, because in this instance, this is an instance where these old theories, they do hold some weight, but they're just lacking in some areas. That's why it's important to understand these. That's part one. Part two then is basically power. To what level, to what degree does the leader have the power to do what needs to be done? And then three is kind of the group structure. And they talk a lot about this in the next couple pages, because they give an actual inventory, and it talks a lot about how if you were a low LPC task-oriented leader, then you need all favorable kind of situations. On the other hand, you have the high LPC relationship-oriented leaders expected to be more effective in situations of intermediate favorableness. So basically talking about the relationship here, at what point are you going to have high effectiveness? And then on 25 it kind of goes into the breakdown of that, where you can see if you have good relations and a high task structure and a strong power position, then the optimal leader style will be a low LPC. So again, kind of an interesting theory there. And then we move into the perception approach. And it's basically here, the leader isn't necessarily, this is going to be one that is not a born leader, because in this one it's being perceived as the leader. So in this case, the group kind of forms a leader through perception. And then within this perception, they actually have what's called the leadership categorization theory. And basically what that says is that these groups, they have this expectation for a leader. And whoever fits that expectation becomes the leader. And, oh, sorry, that was the... leadership categorization theory. And so the idea here, like I said, is that the expectations of the group and whoever fits it becomes that leader. And so I don't want you to freak out too much, because I know I'm going through this kind of fast, and you're kind of probably thinking to yourself like, oh crap, I'm not getting it. Remember, this is just an overview. The idea here is for you to read this, to listen to this, go back into the reading, read it, and you don't have to memorize all of them. Actually, I would rather you didn't memorize all of them. I'd like you to focus on one, because in the next one, the next assignment, you can kind of see where we're going with this, the downfall assignment. What I've done is I've given you a list of leaders. These are fictional and non-fictional leaders, because you see down here I have like Negan from The Walking Dead, Captain America, but then I also have people from literature like King Arthur, Robert Neville, Lizzie from Pride and Prejudice, but then I have other people like George Bush, Barack Obama, Hitler. So you can choose. And the idea here is I want you to look at these leaders and pay particular attention, do some research on these guys, and pay particular attention to their downfall. What is it, at what point did they actually stop being a quote-unquote good leader? Most of them died, so that's kind of when they stopped being a good leader. But you could look at someone like maybe Negan, if you're watching The Walking Dead. He's obviously not dead yet. So, but that doesn't necessarily mean that he's a good leader. However, he is an effective leader. He has people following him, a great many people, and he's portrayed as a not so good, not so moral person, not so ethical. And so it kind of creates the question of, if he's not ethical, where are we at there? Waiting for this to load up. We're falling behind here. We're coming. Well, anyways, back when I talked about ethics, we talked about a leader has to be ethical. It has to show that he has the same goals in mind as the rest. I'm just like you, right? The ethical persuasion. So then why does someone like Negan, who goes around bashing people's heads in with a baseball bat, why is he an effective leader for this group? And so you have to think about, at what point did he have a downfall? In which case, in the show, obviously our protagonist, the good guy, kind of brought Negan down. So if you don't watch The Walking Dead, this is going to make sense, but I'm going to go back and I'll talk about like Barack Obama or something. But Negan, Rick kind of takes him down, right? And so that would be essentially his downfall. But is that really the point at which he stopped being a good leader, or is there a point before that? Either way, I want you to look at the theories that we're talking about, all these ones that I'm kind of going over in this video and in the book, and I want you to find one that you think fits one of these leaders. And I want you to find out, let's say that we went with Hitler. You could say that his downfall from being a good leader could be somewhere in his reign, at which point you might say that the point where he really starts going crazy and starts killing all these Jewish people, that's the point where he stopped being a good leader. And his downfall, if you looked at it from maybe the great man theory, you could say that Hitler stopped being a good leader whenever he lost his ethical appeal. And that would be, I wish this would move up. Alright, whatever, I guess. There we go. When he lost his ethical appeal, was whenever he started committing murder. And that's kind of the point that he stopped being a good leader. And so from the great man perspective, he lost his ethos, he lost his ethics, he lost his ethical trait. However, if you might also say that maybe it was whenever he died that he stopped being, like he literally stopped being a leader then because he died. But if you look at their point of death as when they stop being good leaders, you have to figure out how that's going to fit into one of these theories. It could definitely be the situational approach. Well, you don't really fit the needs of the people anymore. So maybe go back to perception. You don't really meet the needs of the group anymore. They were expecting, first trait that a leader has to have is they have to be alive. So whenever he died, he didn't really meet that. But that's what I want to hear from you. I want to hear, looking at these leaders, pick one theory that you think really applies to the downfall of that leader, and tell me how that happens. So, for instance, Choose a leader from the list, and using one of those theories, write 250-word response in which you explain the downfall of one leader and how it aligns with one of the theories. That is, if you could blame the downfall of a leader on the lack of some element, which element would you ascribe their downfall to, and which theory does that element fall under? So put simply, which theory and corresponding lack of leadership quality explains why the leader eventually fell. Be sure to provide a citation for the sources used in researching the leader, because you got to do some research on their background, right? All right. So closing this up, we have the transactional. And this one's pretty easy. Basically, it's you're the leader because you can get us there, and we're going to let you be the leader because you can get us there. And so the leader kind of creates a transaction where they say, I'm going to help you. I'm going to get you what you want. Which is also what I want. And underneath this transaction, we have what's called the equity theory. Basically, they say that there's a level of equity that a person builds up psychologically, that if they're a good leader, then they have some authority to kind of spend some power. They call it building psychology. But I think of it like they build up kind of good deeds, good boy points, right? They build up this psychology, and then they're able to kind of spend some of that through action. Because people, once they build up this good psychology, they have some points to spend, and people will actually follow them. Let's see what else we got. We got the power approach. And this one kind of it's kind of under the same idea as a transactional approach, but the power approach is that the leader actually has power to reward people. You think about this one as you're in your workplace, and it would be like your boss comes up to you and says, hey, I really think you'd do well if you went to this training, and if you did this training, then you would be our only person that's qualified to use whatever XYZ software. That's much different if you're maybe he would say, like, if you do that, it's going to help you, it's going to raise your likelihood of getting a promotion whenever your next assessment comes around. Okay, great. If your boss says that, that's one thing. However, if your colleague says that, somebody that's on the same supervisory level as you, you're both equal employees under the same supervisor, if that person comes up to you and says, hey, I think you should go to this training because I think it's going to help you, it holds a different weight because they don't necessarily have the power to say that, to give you that reward, whenever they're not really involved in your assessment, in your overall performance assessment. And so if they don't have the power to reward, then they don't really have the power to be the leader either. And that's kind of a positional one as well. And let's see, I think that's most of the ones that they talk about in the the transformational last one, I believe. No, there's still a couple more. Transformational and measurement and behavioral. Okay, so we got a couple more, just 3. That's a long word. Okay, so the transformational approach here is that this one's talking a lot, if you're familiar with Maslow's hierarchy. And what this says is basically, Maslow's hierarchy is a triangle. I can't remember all the sections, but basically you have your physiological needs here. Physiological, there we go. And this basically means, and up here is self-actualization. And they've changed this a little bit to be a little bit more accurate. It's kind of one of those historical theories where it has some good ideas, but it was lacking a little bit. So they've changed it a little bit since then. But basically, think about it. It says that you can't really graduate to the next level. We'll call this safety. I can't remember the other ones. But if you're, for instance, thrown into a pool, if you're thrown into a pool and you can't swim, you're physiologically in danger, right? You could drown at any minute. If you did that, no one can really ask you to think about what your legacy is for your children, right? that would be kind of more of a self-actualization. What did you contribute to society? You're not really thinking of that when you're drowning, right? You're thinking about, I need air. I need to satisfy my physiological needs before I can start to think about any of the ones above that. And so you kind of graduate from level to level in the hierarchy. The same idea comes with a transformational, is that people they have these moral needs, and that the leader helps them to graduate up these moral needs. Not necessarily Maslow's hierarchy, it's the same idea. Let's see, what do they say are the ones here? So self-esteem, companionship, that's belonging. That all belongs in here. They don't actually talk too much about the elements of the hierarchy. It just talks about how the leader helps people to become more ethical and more moral by helping them through their own hierarchy. Just like Maslow's hierarchy and how you build up through your levels there. So it's a tiered approach that kind of talks about that. And then the measurement approach, that's the next one. They have kind of this assessment where they call it the multi questionnaire. And here they try to identify what are the 4 components that, kind of like the traits up here, like if you go back where they had individual traits with Mann and Stogdill. Those guys, they were measuring these traits, right? They measured intelligence, dominance, masculinity, other things. But the measurement one with this multi-factor leadership questionnaire, it was identifying all of these different transformational approaches or transformational... Oh, sorry. There we go. Transformational. Basically their capacity for that. How likely are they to be able to transform people up into their, we'll call it their self-actualized ethics, where they become more ethical, better people? What's the leader's capacity for transforming people into better people, right? That's kind of what this is assessing. And so they said that the 4 components here of this one, this is hard to write. They looked at charisma. They looked at motivation. And this one's like an inspiring motivation, not their own motivation. And 3, there's, well, they call it intelligence stimulation. I guess we can go with that. And then 4, we'll call it consideration. So basically, this multi-factor leadership questionnaire measured the person's capacity for these 4 items. And that suggests that these 4 items then kind of equal a good leader, right? And again, you may or may not agree with that, but that's kind of the point, is that these theories they aim to explain why people are, or why people could be good leaders. And in this case, your job is kind of to figure out which one do you really believe, which one fits best with you. And then last but not least, we have the behavioral approach. I think there might be one more. And basically the behavioral approach is they did the same thing. They were trying to identify 4 things up here, but they did this, basically they asked, who did they ask? I think it was Ohio State University. They asked 2,000 descriptions of effective leader behavior were collected. And so out of these 2,000, the ones that emerged were these. Consideration, and initiation of structure. Which seems a little bit too simple for me, right? Like there's all these different ideas that we've had that I've been talking about for like the last hour, and we come up with behavioral, and it says that consideration and initiation and structure. So all I got to do is go out there and be considerate to people, but then at the same time just initiate some sort of structure that places me at the top. Is that really what we're talking about here? And so it kind of goes into it. Consideration, it talks about, relates to the leader's willingness to attend to the welfare of those they lead. So looking particularly at the welfare of group. And then also the initiation of structure, the leader's capacity to define and organize people's roles. And so I came into this one thinking like, I don't really I feel like that's just too simple. But then I go back and I make this assignment and I find myself leaning toward, and you can use this if you want to, if you watch The Walking Dead. I watch The Walking Dead and all of a sudden I'm looking at it and I'm like, holy crap, that's kind of what we have here with Negan and with Rick, right? Because we have these two people who are just really trying to protect their group, right? And then in the end, in the process of that, they organize these people into these roles and say, you do this because you're good at it, you do this because you're good at it, you do this because you're good at it. And all of a sudden I come to understand why people like that. Oops, I went back. Why people like that are falling into this group. And so, if you're looking at someone like Mahatma Gandhi, there we are, same idea. Where we go? Here we are. So Mahatma Gandhi is the same idea. You're looking at his consideration. He's obviously interested in the welfare of his people, but at the same time he's trying to organize these people's roles and put them in places where they're going to help people. And so that kind of behaviorally kind of places him in the place of leadership. Let's see, I think that's really all, because then the chapter 2 kind of ends with a call for something that needs to happen, and it basically says that while these theories, behavioral, measurement approach, measurement approach, transformational approach, power approach, equity theory, all those things, they're good. They have their positive aspects, but they're still missing something. And so then the authors, they call for something that considers context. Because they said, even though this is a good idea, consideration and initiation of structure, those are clearly influential. What about the context? What about the group itself? If the group's not there, for instance, followers, then who are they going to lead? Who are they going to organize? They can't possibly become a good leader with just these two things. So they said there needs to be a context. There needs to be, obviously, followers. Can't be a leader without followers. There needs to be power. There needs to be transformation. And later on, they even go in to say one more, and they said there needs to be a collective interest. So now you can expect that in chapter 3, this is kind of what we're going to be getting into. But for right now, we're just reading through chapters 1 and 2, and that is basically the lesson that they are trying to teach. And so now, your job is to kind of go back and complete this assignment in 250 words. Explain to me which leader you chose, explain their downfall, and then come into here and say which one of these theories to you best explains their downfall. Now once you're done with that, I think that is all the stuff that we have for this week. I'm going back here. Yep, that is all we have. So if you have any questions, be sure to post them here, or text, or call me, or email me. Otherwise, that's all I have for this week, and I will see you guys in week